Thou hast ascended in glory, O Christ our God, and gladden thy disciples with the promise of the Holy Spirit, having become confident of the blessing. Verily thou art the Son of God, and deliverer of the world.
Good evening. This is session 2 of our class, Sacrifice in the Bible and Christian Life. And last week we talked about the concept of sacrifice and how it's misunderstood commonly today, how the idea or the concept of sacrifice has changed from ancient times, the world of the Bible, until today. And we ended by proposing a summary of the ancient idea of sacrifice, which we're going to use as an interpretive key to understand the sacrifices in the Bible, Old Testament, New Testament, as well as the sacrifices that we're called to make as Christians in our lives. So today we're going to be talking about the Old Testament sacrifices. And we have a lot of material to cover. So I'm going to try to be as succinct and to the point as I can be. I don't want to keep you here late if at all possible. But there's a lot of important information here that's not just trivia, for your Bible Trivial Pursuit strategy. But this is a foundation for understanding how Christ has saved us. Because we'll find next week that the New Testament interprets Christ's life, death, and resurrection within a sacrificial context. And the effects of it are said to be a fulfillment of the sacrifices in the Old Testament. More on that next week. But just suffice it to say, this will be important background for next week. And interesting in its own right as well. So last week we ended with this idea of relationship building through gift giving, sacrifice as friend-making gift. And that sacrifice is just the religious version of an overall common mode of relationship that was just throughout society in the ancient world. So in all relationships that people wanted to foster with other people, they would include gift giving, gift exchange between the parties as an important element of building those relationships. We still do it today. Maybe less prominently, less ritualistically, but in the ancient world it was a very formal part of building relationships. In terms of sacrifice, this gift giving is directed towards God. And the aim is building a relationship with God. And the point of the gifts is not just their material value, because as the Old Testament reiterates time and again, God doesn't need our stuff. In fact, He gave us all the stuff. He doesn't need food. We discovered that most of the gifts are food. God doesn't need to eat. The value of the gifts is in the meaning that's behind them. Very literally, it is the thought that counts. And it's only the thought that counts. So, as gifts, these sacrifices were symbolic. They were tokens or pledges of goodwill and faithfulness. So, by giving the gift, you were pledging that I want to be in relationship with you. I want to be in a good relationship with you, showing you goodwill, showing you faithfulness, remaining committed in love to this relationship. They were symbolic pledges that the worshiper, by which the worshiper showed that he wanted a friendly relationship with God. Now, religions throughout the world were centered around sacrifices that were based on the same logic. So this idea of sacrifice and the phenomenon of sacrifice is not something we just find in the Bible. In fact, we find very similar practices throughout human cultures. The Jewish sacrifices are similar in some basic ways to the sacrifices that were being done by the Mesopotamians, by the Greeks, by the Romans. They're also very similar in their basic logic to basically every sacrifice that we find in human cultures throughout the world. And this shouldn't surprise us, because in Genesis we find that sacrifice is one of the very earliest things that human beings are recorded as having done. In fact, the very first thing that happens after Adam and Eve after they fall and are sent out of paradise, is they have children, and their two children, their two sons, Cain and Abel, offer sacrifices. So St. Cyril of Alexandria will say that it is a natural human impulse to want to grow closer to God and to demonstrate that desire by offering Him gifts. Now, the problem is, and we see this problem again from the very beginning with Cain and Abel. Abel offers a good and acceptable sacrifice. Cain offers a sacrifice that is unacceptable. And in fact, Cain's unacceptable sacrifice leads to Abel's murder, leads to great evil. So just as Cain's offering was corrupted by sin, so human religion and its sacrifices were distorted by sin. This was something that was there from the beginning in human cultures. That's why there's a similarity around the world, because all of those human cultures came from that same cultural root that we find in Genesis. But there are variances and distortions that came into the practice. And we would say that these were distortions caused by sin and really prompted by demons who were trying to, just as they did in the garden, draw human beings away from the worship of God into false worship, into self-worship, into demonic worship as well. So sacrifices became a mockery. And we see in descriptions of sacrifice, unfortunately, like I said, we have so much material, I can't go into all of it now. But when you read about sacrifices amongst the Greeks or amongst the Mesopotamians, you have stories like in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which talks about how when they offer a sacrifice, the gods gather like flies to feast on the smoke because they need the smoke in order to draw energy. It's like a weird concept of, totally perverse concept of God that describes gods like flies. Like imagine how distorted human beings' minds had become, that they had gone from walking with God in the cool of the day in the Garden of Eden to thinking of gods, multiple gods, and thinking of them as flies that need smoke in order to live. Other examples include Hesiod, who is, contemporary, roughly, of Homer, so a very early Greek author, who describes the origin of Greek sacrifice. And basically it originates with a demand from Zeus that the human beings pay tribute. But then Prometheus, who is one of the sort of semi-divine beings, he helps the human beings out. If you remember, maybe you know Prometheus, he's the one who gave fire to the human race in the Greek mythology. But this is before that happened in the myth. So Prometheus helps the human beings to trick Zeus so that they end up wrapping up, they take an animal, they kill it, and then they take the bones and they wrap the bones in fat. And the meat, the nourishing part, they wrap in the sheep's or in the animal's stomach. And they ask Zeus to choose which one he wants. And he's tricked into choosing the bones because they're wrapped in fat rather than the good stuff, which is wrapped. It's like tricking, first of all, this adversarial relationship that God demands, and then human beings try to trick God. And that doesn't create a relationship, right? It's the opposite of what we're talking about in terms of sacrifice. Digression, sorry. So, after all of this corruption and formation of all these different variants of sacrifice in various different human religions, in the Old Testament, God Himself chooses the people of Israel in order to sort of create a beachhead in the human race, to take this people and teach them how to have a right relationship with Him, so the human beings can recover the right concept, at least, of who God is and how human beings should relate to Him. So, as a part of that, God, and the beginning of that covenant was when God called Abraham and gave him the promises. And then Abraham's descendants later were found in Egypt in slavery, and God sent Moses and his brother Aaron to lead them out of slavery by God's mighty power. And after they had left slavery in Egypt, they went to Mount Sinai, and it was at Mount Sinai that God appeared to Moses and gave him all of the law, gave him the instructions on how the people of Israel should relate to one another in God's presence and how they should relate to God, and including how they should worship God properly, including how they should sacrifice properly. Those instructions are found in the book of Exodus and Leviticus mainly, and then there are some additional details that are given in Numbers and Deuteronomy. So God comes and through Moses teaches the people of Israel how to offer correct sacrifices which reflect how He wants to, what kind of relationship He wants with the people of Israel, and how He wants them to relate to Him. So these are purified sacrifices. These are sacrifices which still have the same basic logic as basically everybody has. That's why when Jews wrote and tried to explain their beliefs to non-Jews, they didn't have to explain, like, this is what sacrifice means. They actually don't give explanations of sacrifice. They just explain what's different between the Jewish sacrifices and the non-Jewish sacrifices. All right. So any questions about that background for the Old Testament sacrifice instructions? Any questions? All right. So keep in mind, though, as we go forward, that pledges, these gifts that are being offered as tokens, are just the beginning of a relationship, right? Think about it in terms of a marriage relationship. So the man offering the woman the ring, the engagement ring, right? That's not it. There's a lot more to do. And the important part is really yet to come. Or the wedding service itself and exchanging those vows, exchanging those rings in the wedding service, what have you. Those initial pledges in any relationship are just the beginning of the relationship. It's follow-through that makes it real. And that is the problem that we'll find with the Old Testament sacrifices. The problem is actually not with the sacrifices themselves. The sacrifices are pure and holy, just as in the New Testament it says, the law itself is good and pure and holy. The problem was there was no follow-through. So, through the sacrifices, the people of Israel offered these pledges to God. Yeah, we want to be in a good relationship with you. We want to be faithful to you. We want to love you. And then they didn't. Then they came back and they did it again. And then they didn't. And they said, oh, I'm sorry, we're sorry, we want to do it again. And then they didn't, And the more that happens in a relationship, the more really repugnant it gets to be. Like, imagine you have a relationship with someone who, is saying like, yeah, I want to be your friend, and then they stab you in the back. And then they come back, oh, I'm sorry, I want to be your friend, and they stab you in the back. And they're constantly doing it. In Christian charity, we are kind to them and we forgive them, but the natural impulse is just to say like, forget it, stop saying it, and just do it. Sorry is as sorry does. And that's kind of where God's attitude is shown to come through the Old Testament up until the latter prophets. So we have in the words of the prophets these proclamations that I don't want your sacrifices. Like, your sacrifices are disgusting to me. But when we read that, we need to keep in mind, he's not contradicting, like, it's not the new God contradicting the old God. It's the same God. And he's not saying that the sacrifices themselves are inherently wrong, but the sacrifices, the rituals without actual practical follow-through are worthless. So that's the problem that we'll find with the sacrifices. All right, now we're going to go through the basics of this sacrificial system that is in the Old Testament. But when I say Old Testament sacrifices, what I mean is the sacrifices of the Old Covenant. So there are other sacrifices that we find that were not part of the Old Covenant. So basically all the sacrifices in Genesis before the Old Covenant came to be, before the Exodus. We're not going to be really going into all that detail. And there are actually a few of the Old Testament sacrifices per se that we're going to have to wait to talk about next week in conjunction with Christ and his fulfillment. But to begin with, the basic parameters of the Old Testament sacrifices. I have 4 P's for you. I was really proud of myself to come up with the 4 P's. We're going to talk about the place of sacrifice, the personnel of sacrifice, the presence, the actual gifts that are offered in sacrifice, and the procedures. So the ritual, how the sacrifices are performed. First, the place. And as we go through this, we're not just talking about the facts on their face. We're talking about the meaning of them as well within the context of this idea of friend-making gifts. So the tabernacle or the temple. I put tabernacle/temple. The tabernacle is actually kind of an old-fashioned name now. It's an old-fashioned word that means tent. And so in a lot of more modern translations, you'll see tent, the tent of meeting. This is what God instructed Moses to construct for the people's worship as they were traveling on their way to the Promised Land. So it was a mobile sanctuary. It was a tent, and all of the furnishings within it were made to be mobile. And there were instructions on how it was all to be packed up, and certain things, really holy things that people shouldn't even touch, were carefully covered. Like the Ark of the Covenant, you couldn't even see the Ark of the Covenant. So they actually took down the tent on top of it and covered it, and then they put poles through rings that were on either side that kind of stuck out, and then they carried it without actually touching the ark. And the same thing was true of the table of the showbread and the altar of incense and the altar of the burnt offerings. All these things had rings in them and poles that would go through them so that they could be carried. So this was a mobile sanctuary. Later, when the people arrived in the Promised Land, God directed David to build a temple for himself, a permanent worship location in Jerusalem. The temple so the temple is the permanent version of the tabernacle. They weren't used simultaneously. The temple followed the tabernacle. But in both cases, the tabernacle or temple represents God's home in the midst of the people. And this is very clear in the scriptures because God tells them that I will dwell there, or he doesn't say actually I will dwell there so much as my presence will dwell there, or my glory will dwell there, or my name will dwell there. Which is a hint to the fact that, of course, God isn't constricted to this location, but it is a focus of his presence. And this tabernacle, as the home of God, was in the exact middle of the encampment of the people of Israel. So whenever they set up camp, the thing in the middle was the tabernacle, and then all the different tribes would camp on each side of it, and around it. When they arrived in Jerusalem, as I said, the temple was built to replace it, a permanent house of the Lord. Also, that term, house of the Lord, is used. We even today call churches houses of God. Now, that points out a difference, though. In the Old Covenant, there was only one house of God. There was only one tabernacle, and then after the tabernacle, there was only one temple. Only one place where sacrificial worship could happen. And this was important because the singularity of the tent or the temple represented the singularity of God. One God has only one temple. That's the only place you can worship. Remember what the context of this is, that you have all of these other cultures where they have so many gods like flies buzzing around altars, and they have different little shrines for each one. And you go to this temple to worship this god, and you go to this temple to worship that god, and actually the same god has different temples in different places, which gets confusing. And then they start to have different identities too. So the Zeus of this city versus the Zeus of that city. And then you have both of those imported into Rome, and they have two separate temples, like it's still Zeus. But no, we're going to worship the Zeus of this or the Zeus of that. It's this multiplicity of gods and multiplicity of the same gods. It just, overflows. And God drives home the fact that, no, there is only one God by saying, no, there's only one place of worship, and you are not allowed to worship any of these other gods or to sacrifice in any of these other places. They are not gods. They're false gods. You can only worship me, and only in this one place, because I am one. So the areas of the temple represent progressive degrees of closeness to God's presence, or we could say progressive degrees of intimacy. And we'll start with, if you want to take your little diagram out, we'll start with the most intense degree of intimacy, which is the most holy place. And in the most holy place is the Ark of the Covenant. Now I'm going to use an analogy, and the purpose is to help you understand. But it might sound a little bit trite. The most holy place is like God's bedroom. If you think of the bedroom in terms of, it's a really intimate place. And like most guests who come visit your house, you don't invite them into your bedroom, right? Your bedroom is a place for really intense, close relationships. And in fact, only one person, well actually, originally, Moses was allowed to go into the Holy of Holies. But after Moses was gone, there was only one official who could go into the Holy of Holies, which is the high priest. And he could only go in once a year. Now, while Moses was alive, he was allowed to go into the Holy of Holies to converse with God, because he was a friend, he was the friend of God, and so he conversed with God. But after that, the regular system allowed only this one rare instance where the high priest on the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, was able to go into the Holy of Holies, or the most holy place, in order to offer a special sacrifice to God. So the most holy place is like God's bedroom. Outside of it, there's another place called the Holy of Holies, called the Holy Place. Just the Holy Place, one holy. Just the Holy Place. The Holy Place we could compare to like God's living room or dining room. Okay, and it has some things you might expect to find in a living room or dining room. There's a table called the table of the showbread, or the table of... Showbread is an old-fashioned term for the bread of the presence, which is mostly translated as today, which was a table on which every day was set out 12 loaves of bread representing the 12 tribes of Israel, and there were containers, vessels of wine on it as well. And a part of the daily sacrifice was that wine would be poured out for God beside the table of the showbread, poured onto the ground as an offering to God, as a part of the daily sacrifice. The bread was sprinkled with incense. In each day, the bread would be gathered, the old bread would be gathered and eaten by the priest, but the incense would be burned, which kind of represented symbolically that God was partaking of the bread as well as the priests, that they were sharing the bread in a sense. There's also a lampstand to bring light into God's living room. This lampstand had to be kept lit continuously. It couldn't be allowed to go out. And so they, actually, interestingly, that's what the Feast of Hanukkah is about. It's about a miracle of the lamp in the temple, that because of a siege or something, they couldn't get oil to feed the temple lamp, but it miraculously kept burning until they were able to get the oil for like way longer than it should have been able to. Then there's the altar of incense, which is a small altar, and everything in the holy place, as well as everything in the most holy place, is covered in gold. The altar of incense was used twice a day to offer incense on it. And remember, we talked about incense and the meaning of it. We'll talk about it a little bit more later. But suffice it to say, that is the holy place, and only the priests could go in there. The priests could go in there, but not even the Levites, and definitely not just regular Joes could go in there. Now, outside of the tent, so this is the tent itself. That's the tent of meeting, and it is covered. But outside of it is an uncovered, open enclosure called the courtyard. And the courtyard is surrounded by this high barrier, which is, again, packed up and moved every time that the people move. Within this enclosure, there is the altar of the burnt offerings. Now, there are two altars. The altar of the incense inside the most holy, or inside the holy place, I have to be careful, inside the holy place, is only used for incense. That's the only thing that can be offered on it. Everything else that's burnt up for God is, all the food offerings are burnt on the altar of the burnt offerings. Then there's what's called the laver or the laver, which is this circle here. It's a large container of water because they had to clean, things that they used in sacrifice. So we've been talking about symbolism, comparing the tabernacle to God's home. What would you say the courtyard is like? If the tent is his house, what is the courtyard? His yard. It's his yard. It's God's yard, and God has a grill on his yard. No, really. I mean, it's kind of funny because we're not used to it, but that is really what it represents. Now, it's much more significant because it belongs to God, but that's what all of these items, that's where they draw their symbolism from. Okay? The altar, by the way, the altar was fairly big. For the tabernacle, it was 7.5 feet by 7.5 feet square and 4.5 feet tall. In the temple, it was 30 feet by 30 feet and 15 feet tall. So it had a ramp to get up to it. Okay, any questions about the tabernacle and temple? Yeah.
The mobile tabernacle and the permanent temple, were they identical other than being small, one being smaller? And they were the same?
Basically, they were the same, except the temple was on a larger scale. So instead of one lampstand, the temple had like 10 lampstands. And each lampstand had 7. It was a 7-branch lampstand, but and like I said, the altar was bigger. Things were made of solid gold in the temple, whereas for the tabernacle, they were overlaid with gold. They were wood overlaid with gold, which if you think about this being carried, that's there's a reason for it.
The walls of the courtyard were wood, right?
Yeah, well, stone. So everything was constructed out of, in the temple, everything was constructed out of stone. In the tabernacle, everything was curtains, these like fabric. Yeah, it were fabric and then held up with posts and, so even the fence, the enclosure around the courtyard was big pieces of fabric. And the tent, though, had a waterproof roof, had certain animal skins on it, on top of the cloth. It's very detailed instructions, so it would be waterproof. Other questions?
Yeah, there's not, as far as the material in the temple, there weren't detailed instructions for that, right? Solomon just...
I think he used the tabernacle instructions and then elaborated on them. There is a description of what he does, but I don't think it's phrased in terms of God told him to say it or told him to do it.
I guess at that time they understood and they were just yeah, that would work too as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. You could say that there's maybe some good and bad in that. It might represent, sort of like Solomon's upping the ante, but the people are still failing to follow God's commandments. You see what I'm saying? Like you're offering a bigger gift, and like we want to try again and be that faithful people you want us to be. So we're going to offer a bigger gift. And while the sentiment is nice, it's still really the most important thing is the action. And we see with Solomon himself, he even falls into idolatry after he builds the temple.
Yeah, he did more for himself.
Yeah, it's kind of, I don't know. Mixed motives, probably like all of us, right? Okay, personnel. The personnel of the tabernacle and temple are the priests and the Levites. And they were God's hereditary servants. Their responsibility primarily had to do with sacrifice. The priests were the descendants of Aaron originally, and then later on, after the exile, that changed a little bit, and it became the sons of Zadok. But for our purposes, the sons of Aaron are the priests, and they are headed by a high priest. And they're the ones who actually make offerings to God. They're the ones who actually perform the sacrifices. They have additional responsibility to teach the people God's law. That was their responsibility as well, to teach the law. Now the Levites were a much larger group, and they were members of the tribe of Levi, which was Moses and Aaron's tribe. So there were 12 tribes of the people of Israel. This was a large family group, descendant from Levi, one of the sons of Jacob. And the Levites were responsible for assisting the priests. And one of their big jobs during the time of the wandering in the desert was to pack up the tabernacle and to carry it. They were also responsible for helping out with kind of secondary roles, assisting roles in the sacrifices. Now, in the instructions of the first 5 books of the Bible, there's no mention, this is very interesting, there's no mention of prayers or hymns in the tabernacle. It's called, some scholars have called it the tent of silence, because there's no instruction. That doesn't say that there wasn't any hymn singing or prayers offered. It just doesn't say that there was. The focus is on the practicality of the rituals. We do read, though, in later history books, that the Levites were responsible for singing hymns of praise while the sacrifices were going on. So whether that was something that started later or something that started from the beginning but just wasn't recorded, we don't know. But the Levites were also church singers, or temple singers.
Is that mentioned somewhere, like in the prophets?
No, it's mentioned in the history, one of the history books. I don't have the reference with me, but it's like 1st or 2nd Chronicles, I think.
So the priests were not Levites, or they were Levites, right?
Well, the priests were part of the same tribe, just a smaller group within the tribe. So the Levites would be all of the descendants of Levi except for the priests. Or you could say the priests were a subset of the Levites, an elite subset of the Levites. So another significant difference between pagan religions and the Old Covenant is that the king could not act as priest. In a lot of those ancient societies, the kings, they had sort of like priest kings. And the kings were the mediators with God, or the gods. And the kings were in charge of offering sacrifices, but that is intentionally ruled out by this, because the kings don't come from the tribe of Levi. In fact, at this time, there are no kings. Actually, the Levites are in control. Later, there's kings who do the political ruling, but again, they are separate from the priests. They're not able to offer sacrifice. Actually, one of the kings, out of envy for Gentiles, asserts himself and forces a new altar to be made, and he himself offers the sacrifices. And that's a sign of the decline of the people of Israel towards, away from the covenant. Is this king offering sacrifice. Also, it's significant that the Levites were not allocated any territory of their own. So all the other tribes had land that was allocated to them that they could live on, and they could farm. But the Levites did not have land of their own. They were scattered throughout the other tribes, and they were dependent on financial, material support from the other tribes. That's how they lived. So the tithes that were offered were used for the upkeep of the temple as well as for the maintenance of the Levites. What's significant about that and different from other religions. I really don't know of a similar example among Gentile religions, is that all of the regular sacrifices, all of the main sacrifices that happened in the tabernacle and temple were funded by the people as a whole. Now, in Gentile religions, those different sacrificial rituals were dependent on rich people, giving what was necessary for the sacrifice. And what developed was these cultures, in those Gentile cultures, of rich people who would, try to appear, pious by putting their name on the sacrifices. And there would be inscriptions that say, this sacrifice offered by, whoever. And so it becomes really an effort of pride, right? The requirement, the way that this is set up in the Old Covenant actually rules that out. So nobody can be like a religious big deal because, you can't sort of study and become a priest, You're just a priest or you aren't. You're a Levite or you aren't, by the way you're born. You can't sort of assert yourself individually to enter into that role. And then also, non-priests can't say, well, this sacrifice offered by, in terms of the main sacrifices, the most significant sacrifices. The exceptions would be people offering sacrifices, because you could offer sacrifice for your own benefit. So personal sacrifices, but you're not offering it for the community's benefit. So you see what I'm saying? Whereas in those Gentile religions, the public sacrifices, the community sacrifices depended on wealthy patrons. Okay, any questions about the personnel? All right, the presents. Presents, what are the acceptable offerings to God? God's law specifies what can be offered in sacrifice. Number one, incense. Incense is part of the sacrificial worship. It basically follows the same pattern as the other sacrifices in that it is burned, and it is sent to God by being burned, by being turned into smoke. The symbolism of incense we talked about, I think, last week. It's a sweet and welcoming scent. Again, borrowing from our everyday experience. It'd be similar to when you invite someone into your home, you light a scented candle, or when you want to have a relationship with someone, you use cologne or perfume. That offering of sweet smell is a gesture of welcome. Then there's non-animal food and drink. Grain was offered, but usually processed grain was offered. Just flour could be offered, but it had to be the finest flour. It couldn't be just coarse flour. The law specifies that fine flour needs to be offered. Or more frequently, baked goods were offered, following certain specifications that are laid out in Leviticus. So these cakes of flour could be baked in the oven, or they could be baked on a griddle, or in a pan. They could be fried in a pan. So and it specifies in Leviticus that there are these different options. Yeast was not to be used in the sacrifices burnt on the altar. The things that were actually offered to God could not have yeast in them. This because yeast biblically is a symbol of corruption and therefore has symbolic associations with sin. So a yeast-free loaf or cake or wafer would be offered as being a more pure offering symbolically. Olive oil was required to be a part of all of the grain, flour, or baked good offerings, except when those offerings were for a sad occasion. Okay, so whenever they were for a happy occasion, oil had to be on them. But, for example, there were certain sin offerings. Like if you sinned and you wanted God's forgiveness, you could offer, one of these things, but it can't have oil on it because you're repentant, you're sorrowful. And there were a couple of other occasions. So that the olive oil represents joy. Salt had to be added to all of the offerings that were burnt on the altar. An interesting prescription. Why salt? Well, scholars point to its preservative quality, that salt was used to preserve things, to keep them from going bad. And so salt represents lasting commitment. It represents that these sacrifices, these gifts, represent a lasting commitment to God. That's part of it, but I also think part of it is the savor of salt. Like if you cooked a meal for someone without salt, they probably wouldn't enjoy it as much as if you cooked a meal for them that had salt on it. And so when you're offering God food, you need to make sure it's good food. But symbolically speaking, beyond that, that savor, I think, of salt represents genuineness, authenticity, like genuineness. And where I get that from is what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5, verse 13, in the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus said, "You are the salt of the earth, but if salt lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trodden underfoot by men." And I think that's what Jesus is talking about there, using this analogy, is that if you don't genuinely serve God from your heart, then your service is worthless and is to be tossed out on the street. But if there's genuineness, it enlivens the gift. It makes the gift savory to God. But salt has to be on all the meat offerings as well as all the grain offerings. And baked goods have to have salt in them. Okay, animal offerings. So animal offerings are the ones that we are more familiar with. Again, they are food offerings representing hospitality and fellowship. Their meat was burned on the altar together with the non-animal food. So all of the food was put together on the altar. And that's something that we miss, is that a lot of these offerings, animal offerings, there was a requirement that they be accompanied by grain offerings so that a full meal would be burned together on the altar, so to speak. Sacrificial animals must be okay, before I go to that. And again, the offering of food represents hospitality and welcome. We talked about this last week, but I didn't really emphasize it today. Food is love. And we can see that just on a human level. Food is a way of showing love. Food is a way of welcoming people. And the more effort and the more expense you put into the food, the more of a welcome it can represent. And so the same dynamic is at work in the sacrifices, that they are gifts presented to welcome God as a honored guest. Sacrificial animals must be properly owned by the offerer, and they have to come at a cost. This is interesting. So there are certain things that are ruled out, and we'll see this in one of the later quotes. Hunted game could not be offered on the altar. Like if you went out and shot a deer, you couldn't offer that on the altar. Only domesticated animals were offered on the altar. And scholars say that is explained by this emphasis on ownership and on the effort that's required to care for the animals and to prepare the animals as sacrifice, that makes it more significant when you've invested your time and effort in raising the animal. Another example is, it's not that hunting was bad, because people still ate things, in their homes that were hunted, but you couldn't offer them on the altar. You couldn't offer the proceeds of theft. That's one of the problems that is noted by the prophets in the later in the Old Testament, is that sacrifices were being made by people who, either through actual theft or through their economic oppression of other people, had amassed wealth that was not rightly theirs. And if they used that wealth then to fund sacrifices, the sacrifices are tainted because they don't have proper ownership and of the sacrificial material. And then another example is even gifts that you receive. So there's a story that's told in, I forget, one of the history books, 1 Kings maybe, about David. David was offered something like some animals in order that they be offered as a gift, because King David wanted to offer a sacrifice. And so a local farmer was being friendly and said, "Here, why don't you just take these and offer them?" And David said, "I can't offer what has come to me at no cost." So he insisted on paying for them, so that then they came at a cost to him, and were therefore valid offerings. Cost makes a gift more significant, symbolically speaking, and also it clearly identifies it with the offerer. So there's a connection, a symbolic connection created through ownership between the offerer and what he's offering, the gift that he's offering. All the animals offered to God must be domesticated animals. I mentioned this before. So the animals specified are oxen, sheep, goats, and then certain domesticated birds. Again, not birds that you caught by hunting, but species of doves that were similar to homing pigeons that could be kept. Domesticated animals are symbolically significant because they submit to mankind and they serve our needs. Okay? So that domestication represents submission and service. When domesticated animals are offered to God, they therefore represent a commitment to submit to God and to serve God. And this analogy of the relationship between God and man is actually extended to and repeated in several places, where the people of Israel are called God's flock and God is called their shepherd. Okay? So part of the reason, part of the symbolism for offering domesticated animals was to represent a commitment to be a docile, sheep in God's flock. Domesticated animals are also not predators. And they're beneficial so they're not predators hurting others in order to gain for themselves. And they're beneficial to mankind through the milk, the wool, and the meat that they produce. And that indicates a commitment on the part of the offerer to virtuous gentleness and care for others. So you see there's lots of symbolism wrapped up in the kinds of gifts that are offered. Another important requirement is that the animals must be physically perfect and unblemished. So they can't have any blemish, they can't have any defect. They can't, and actually I have a quote for you. Leviticus 22, 17 through 25. And the Lord said to Moses, "Say to Aaron and his sons and all the people of Israel, when anyone of the house of Israel or of the sojourners in Israel presents his offering, whether in payment of a vow or as a free will offering, which is offered to the Lord as a burnt offering to be accepted, you shall offer a male without blemish of the bulls or of the sheep or the goats. You shall not offer anything that has a blemish, for it will not be acceptable to you, or it will not be acceptable for you." This is an important phrase that's used throughout the Leviticus instructions, that you want God to accept you through the offering. And if you offer rightly, then God will accept you through the offering, just like God accepted Abel when he offered a right offering. But if you offer wrongly, with the wrong spirit, or the wrong intention, or the wrong practice, which expresses the wrong spirit, then you will not be accepted by virtue of your gift. Okay, so you want the sacrifice to be acceptable for you, and part of the requirements is that it be without blemish. And when anyone offers a sacrifice of peace offerings to the Lord, these are different kinds of offerings, we won't go into that, to fulfill a vow or as a free will offering from the herd or from the flocks, to be accepted it must be perfect. There shall be no blemish in it. Animals blind or disabled or mutilated or having a discharge or an itch or scabs, you shall not offer to the Lord or make of them an offering by fire. I think when it's talking about discharges and itches and scabs, it's talking about disease. It can't be diseased or injured in any way. Or make of them an offering of fire offering by fire upon the altar of the Lord. A bull or a lamb which has a part too long or too short. Now this is an iffy case because it's not injured, but it's just kind of weird. He says you may present it for a free will offering. So for kind of maybe this lesser form of offering you can offer it, but for a votive offering it cannot be accepted. Okay. Any animal which has its testicles bruised or crushed or torn or cut, you shall not offer to the Lord or sacrifice within your land. Neither shall you offer as the bread of your God. This is a term that's used. And that word bread in Hebrew actually should be translated food. It literally means bread, but the word bread in Hebrew is also used generally to refer to all kinds of food. So the food of your God, sacrifice is called the food of your God. Neither shall you offer as the food of your God any such animal gotten from a foreigner. Since there is a blemish in them because of their mutilation, they will not be accepted for you. All right, so the animals have to be pure and without defect to represent purity, spiritual purity and wholeness on the part of the offerer. Their physical perfection symbolizes the spiritual perfection that God desires from mankind, a life free from the defects of sin. Philo of Alexandria writes about that. I'm going to have several quotes from Philo of Alexandria. Some of you may know who that is, maybe you don't. But he is a Jewish author almost exactly around the time of Christ. But he lived in Alexandria, Egypt, and he doesn't ever mention Christ. So apparently he didn't know about Christ. But he lived in Alexandria and he wrote about the Old Testament, especially about the law, and gave spiritual interpretations of it, which are very sympathetic to Christian readings of the Old Testament. In fact, he talks about the Word of God, the Logos, as being an actual person. And other things as well. But he spiritually interprets the law, and this law of sacrifice is of interest to us. And this is what he says specifically about this requirement. He says, the victims must be whole and entire, without blemish on any part of their bodies, unmutilated, perfect in every part. and without spot or defect of any kind. God designed or intended to teach the Jews by these figures or symbols whenever they went up to the altars, when they're to pray or to give thanks, never to bring with them any weakness or evil passion in their soul. So a blemish would be symbolic of weakness or evil passion in their soul, but to endeavor to make it holy and entirely bright and clean, without any blemish, so that God might not turn away with aversion from the sight of it. So again, Philo says the point of the gift being physically without defect and free of blemish is that it would represent the actual state of the worshiper's soul, or at least their commitment and their intention to live in such a way. It is particular. Yes, Greg?
Is there also a component of giving your scraps, like when you
Yeah.
give you give the best cattle, the best animals,
Right.
you give the sick and diseased or broken down?
That's part of it as well, yeah, is that you don't want to give God second best. You want to give God the best. That's part of the significance of the preference for male animals, because of the sort of patriarchal society that they were in, and also that's part of the significance of young animals. In certain cases, it's required that young animals be offered because younger meat is more tender. It's more prized. So, so that's definitely part of it too. It makes the food offering better, more significant. Others? All right, so it is particularly the blood of the animal that has symbolic value. And when animals are sacrificed, they produce two different offerings that are given to the Lord. Those offerings are not equivalent we'll talk a little bit more about what they mean and the different function or symbolic function that they have. But when the animal is killed, its blood is collected to be presented to the Lord, to be offered to the Lord, and its meat is extracted to be offered to the Lord. So we've talked so far about the animal as a whole, but also about the meat. Now about the blood. The blood is particularly symbolic. And we learn about the symbolism of blood from Leviticus chapter 17, verses 10 through 12. You have this quote. By the way, and you'll hear this in this passage, it was forbidden for the people of Israel to eat blood or to drink blood as their food because of its symbolic significance. And I'll talk a little bit more about that after we read, but keep that in mind. So the Lord said to Moses, "If any man of the house of Israel or of the strangers that sojourn among them eats any blood, I will set my face against that person who eats blood and will cut him off from among his people." This is very serious. Basically, God's going to destroy him. Cut off means destroy. "For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it for you upon the altar to make atonement for your souls, for it is the blood that makes atonement by reason of the life." We're going to look at that verse. That's verse 11. We're going to look at that more carefully in a second. "Therefore I have said to the people of Israel, no person among you shall eat blood, neither shall any stranger who sojourns among you eat blood." So the prohibition on eating blood has to do with the symbolism of sacrifice that's attached to the symbolism of blood offered in sacrifice. And that centers around verse 11. Now, I've made my own translation of the Septuagint to make clear the wording in Greek. of verse 11. So Leviticus chapter 17, verse 11, Father Jeremy's translation from the Greek text of the Septuagint, says, "The soul of all flesh is its blood." So the first thing to note is, in the above translation, it has the word life. The life of the flesh is in its blood, and I have given it to you upon the altar to make atonement for your souls, for it is the blood that makes atonement by reason of the life. Both in Hebrew and in Greek, it's the same word that's being translated in the RSV, either soul or life. And literally, it means that word means soul. In Hebrew, it's nephesh. In Greek, it's psyche or psyche, which is, we all know, is the root of psychology, and it literally means soul. Both of these words literally mean soul. Soul in that ancient mentality was understood to mean the life force. The life force. So in Greek philosophy, Aristotle would say there are 3 different kinds of soul. Actually, plants have souls because they grow, right? They have life force that causes them to grow. But it's a lesser form of life than animal soul. Animals have a soul which causes them to grow, and it has added features. And then the human soul is the highest form of soul. But again, it's not exactly what we think of when we say soul. When we say soul, we think of like a ghost. This literally means life force. But I've translated it literally, so you'll see the soul of all flesh. In the translation above, it reads, is in the blood. But literally it says, the soul of all flesh is the blood. The soul of all flesh is its blood, and I have given it to you to make atonement on the altar concerning your souls, for its blood, the animal's blood, makes atonement for the sake of the soul, or in place of the soul. So what is he talking about here? Biblically, blood represents the life force or the soul. And you can see why people, like, this is a natural symbolism. Because if you take the blood out of any animal or person, they're not alive anymore, right? And more than that, even without that sort of gruesome thought, you know that someone's alive by the pulsing of blood within them, right? The blood is moving. It's this active force that's at work keeping us alive. Blood is identified in many cultures, many sort of what we call primitive cultures, but like cultures that are, anyway, we call them primitive cultures. Blood is considered to be invested with the character. And in that sense, we could say the soul also refers to, soul here also refers to character or identity, that life force that makes a being what it is. In certain quote-unquote primitive cultures, it's believed that, that if you hunt like a bear, you hunt a bear and you kill it and you drink its blood, then you'll have the strength of the bear, right? I mean, that's a common theme in a lot of these kind of mythologies. And you can see where that comes from. So, biblically, blood represents the life force or the soul, the character or identity. In the sacrifices, the offering of the animal's blood represents the offering of the animal's qualities for the benefit of the offerer. So all the things we've talked about that the animal represents, domesticated, so submissive, beneficial, pure, without defect, all of these things are kind of housed in the blood, symbolically speaking. Get that? So then the blood becomes a symbolic gift. I think it's important to explain this because for us, the idea of offering blood to God is like gross. Like, why would you do that? But the reason why you do it is not because God's like this bloodthirsty, being, but rather because blood has a special significance. The soul the soul of all flesh is its blood. And when you offer it on the altar, it's accepted in place of your soul or in connection with your soul, right? It becomes a symbol for your commitment to embody those same characteristics or qualities. Questions? Thoughts? Does this make sense? Okay, all right. Procedures, the steps of animal sacrifice. So the animal sacrifices all follow the same basic procedure. And there are different little tweaks and there are odd cases. The birds are an odd case, but it's because of the physical anatomy of the birds that presents a problem for following all these steps. We'll leave that to one side because we don't have a lot of time. But all of the quadrupeds that are offered, the oxen and sheep and goats, are offered following the same pattern. First, and this step is implicit in the text, but very important, it's the preparation and selection of the animal. We just got finished talking about all the qualities that the present or the gift has to have. Which means that you cannot just go out and pick whatever animals in the barnyard when you're ready to make sacrifice. More importantly, so instead of just picking any animal, you have to go and you have to examine them and you have to make sure that there is no possible defect. Also, you're probably going to put some effort into making sure you have animals that are fit for sacrifice. When you have new animals born, you'll examine them and see, do they have any sort of birth defects or problems? If they don't, then you might designate certain animals to raise in a protected environment because you don't want them to get injured. You don't want them to get diseased. Another element of preparation, it's actually prohibited in the law to offer a mother and its calf on the same day. They can't be offered on the same day. That means you have to keep a birth record of your animals. So there's a lot of preparation and care that goes into sacrifice before you even get to the tabernacle or the temple. So after the preparation and selection, you have the presentation. And this is explicitly stated in Leviticus that the offerer shall bring the animal before the Lord into the presence of the Lord, which means into the courtyard, the outer courtyard, and will present it to the Lord. So you bring it and you show it to the Lord. And then as a part of that is the next step, which is identification. That's my word for it. There's different words the scholars use. But what I'm referring to here is the gesture. The offerer lays his hand on the animal's head. And commentators actually say that the Hebrew word there means to press down. So somehow he very firmly puts one hand on the head of the animal. Okay? This is a symbolic action that is misinterpreted in a lot of people's theology. It's misinterpreted as indicating a transference of guilt. It's one way of interpreting that, the idea that the offerer is full of sin. He puts his hand on the animal and zaps it with all his sin, and then the animal gets killed, and so he doesn't have to get killed for his sins. Now, I think we've seen that, and we're going to see that that isn't the significance of sacrifice. What is, though, the significance of that placing of the hand in the presence of the Lord? So you bring the animal in, you place your hand on the animal in the presence of the Lord. He identifies the offering as belonging to him before God. So he says, this is my offering. And therefore, as representing him, in this very symbolic touch, he connects himself to the offering and identifies himself symbolically with the offering. Okay? The offerer thus identifies himself with the qualities represented by the animal: service to God, purity of life, and he pledges symbolically to God that this is how he intends to live. As I was preparing, I had the thought of, we're getting into political ad season, and political ads, at the end of each ad, you have, I'm so-and-so and I approve this message. It's sort of the same thing in terms of sacrifice, I'm Father Jeremy and I approve this sacrifice. This is mine. This is mine. This belongs to me. This is who I am. Philo of Alexandria gives a similar interpretation. Special Laws 1:202 through 04. He says, the hands which are laid upon the head of the victim are a most manifest symbol of irreproachable actions, and of a life which does nothing which is open to accusation, but which in all respects is passed in a manner consistent with the laws and ordinances of nature. This is a way of saying a virtuous life, a righteous life. For the law, in the first place, desires that the mind of the man who is offering the sacrifice shall be made holy by being exercised in good and advantageous doctrines, and in the second place, that his life shall consist of most virtuous actions, so that in conjunction with the imposition of hands, the man may speak freely out of his clean conscience and may say, these hands have never received any gift as a bribe to commit an unjust action, nor any division of what has been obtained by rapine, violence, or by covetousness. Nor have they shed innocent blood, nor have they wrought mutilation, nor works of insolence, nor acts of violence, nor have they inflicted any wounds, nor in fact have they performed any action whatever which is liable to accusation or to reproach, but they have been ministers in everything which is honorable and advantageous, and which is honored by wisdom or by laws or by honorable and virtuous men. Now obviously Philo is elaborating based on his understanding of virtue and righteousness, and he's giving several examples. But the fundamental thing that he's saying is that by placing your hand on the animal, you are identifying yourself with the purity and the goodness that the animal symbolizes. And you're identifying your soul, really, with the physical attributes, the good physical attributes of the animal. And Philo states this in retrospective terms, saying that when you come, you're saying, this is how I have been. However, it seems like sacrifices function not just in retrospective terms, but also in prospective terms, meaning as a commitment to the future, especially in terms of sacrifices for sin. Because the point of that is you've done something wrong. And you come and you lay your hand on the animal, but then you're making a commitment saying that I'm repenting. I'm not going to be like that anymore. I'm going to be like the purity symbolized by the animal. Okay? After the identification or the pressing of the hand comes slaughter. The slaughter at least originally, was most likely performed by the offerer himself. The animal is killed, its blood is collected, and the carcass is skinned and divided into portions. Also, the dirty parts, like the intestines, are washed out. And then finally, all the meat is salted before it's placed on the altar. Now this again, we talked about last week how this sounds like really gruesome to us. But really, this is butchering the animal. This is like what they have to do in order for you to buy meat at the grocery store. It's exactly the same thing. In terms of killing the animal, skinning the carcass, dividing it into portions, and then washing the dirty parts. The important thing to note here is that the animal has to be prepared, the meat has to be prepared. Animal has to be turned into meat before it can be burned on the altar. Right? You don't just, the dead animal is not a proper sacrifice in and of itself. If a dead animal was a proper sacrifice, you wouldn't have to go to all this work, right? You just throw it up on the altar. But you have to do all this work in order to turn it into proper food, including salting it, even. Then comes the application of the blood, and this actually happens while the animal is being butchered. So when the animal is killed, the blood is collected, and then the blood is applied to the altar while the animal is being divided into pieces. The priests apply the blood in a specific manner to the altar. Sometimes it's applied to other areas of the tabernacle, but almost always to the altar, in a specified way. The blood is a link, symbolically, from the offer to God through the altar. Now, this is, again, where the placement of the hand is symbolic, because think through the stages. The offerer places his hand, kills the animal, from the offerer's hand to the animal, to its blood, carried to the altar, which represents God. The blood carries all the symbolic weight we just discussed as the soul of all flesh. And it precedes the offering of the food gift. It always precedes the offering of the food gift, meaning the burning of the meat. So the blood is always applied to the altar before the burning of the meat. So I would suggest that this gesture, even though it's hard for us to get our minds around applying blood to an altar, it sounds like Halloween, but it's not Halloween for the Jews, obviously, or for God. I would suggest that this gesture has a similar meaning to, bear with me, a handshake or a greeting that initiates the giving of a gift. This is the initiation. This is the offerer sending forth this message that I want to be friends with you. And this is how I want our friendship to last, to run. It is a meaningful introductory gesture which therefore casts the gift in a certain light. Like, think about when you give gifts. You don't just walk up to somebody and just give them there's this introductory sort of process where you talk and you have a personal connection with them before you convey the gift. And that puts the gift in a certain context. I would say that is the point of the application of the blood, that the blood initiates the gift and it provides the context in which the gift is to be taken, the food gift. Now that is very abstract, so I would invite questions if you have them. You don't even know what to ask?
Where I'm stubbing my toe,
Yeah.
is that what is considered the life force, the soul? A handshake is less intimate to me
Mm-hmm.
than your soul and your life force. You're offering
Yeah.
the very essence of yourself.
Right, right.
Yes.
It's maybe the highest form, the epitome of handshake, which, when you think about all the gifts we're offering to God, it's the highest form. And He has a house that has all its furnishings in gold.
For me, it makes me think it's the essence, my soul, and the meat is my body. It's like it's
It could be, yeah,
just
maybe.
based on what you've given me.
Yeah, yeah. Could be. It is important that the blood is not called food for God. The meat, in all the contexts where it uses that phrase, the bread of your God or the food of your God, it's referring to meat, to the meat part of the animal offering, not to the blood part. So the blood is taken in a different sense from the meat. And it's always introductory or preliminary. And this is going to be an important point because a huge, like really the most important aspect of Christ's sacrifice is His blood and what His blood does for us. So here we're laying some groundwork for next week when we're going to talk about what Christ's blood does for us. Okay? Because obviously the symbolism of His blood is connected to the blood of the Old Testament sacrifices. Great.
Is there a reconciling component to the blood?
In the sense that a handshake can be reconciling. Now,
I mean, does it restore the relationship? Is that?
I'm not apart from the meat offering. The application of blood does not occur separated from the meat offering. It is a continuity. So it has to be understood in that context. And it always prepares for the meat offering. And so, now I'm not going to put too fine of a point on this, but if one aspect prepares for another aspect, the other aspect is the focus, right? Not the preparatory aspect, but the food offering would be the focus. The blood application is essential, and it sets the tone for the food offering, but the food offering has to happen. And there are other offerings like the grain offerings. Obviously, grain doesn't have blood. So there's no blood offering before that, but the grain is offered on the altar. So in order for an offering to occur, something has to be burnt. And that's the focus. In fact, as I told you last week, the literal meaning of the Greek word for sacrifice is to turn into smoke. But reconciliation is part of the point. And we're going to talk about the idea of atonement next week. But atonement is the purpose of most of these sacrifices, and sacrifices in general. Okay, after the application of the blood to the altar in a specific way, God's portion of the meat is burned. And we'll talk about that. Varies from sacrifice to sacrifice, but we'll talk about that. And then finally, if there is any meat remaining, it is consumed in a specified manner. So, meat burning and consuming the remainder. And in these cases, the meat that's burned on the altar is God's portion, and what's consumed, the remainder, is somebody else's portion. Okay, I'm sorry, we have a lot of material to cover. I'm going to try to buzz through it. Okay, the kinds of sacrifice. There are many kinds of sacrifice in the Old Testament, and it's hard to group them without some help. Luckily, we have some help from Philo, our friend Philo. Philo of Alexandria groups the sacrifices into three general categories with certain purposes. Each category has a specific purpose. He says, thus, very properly, there are three offerings for three purposes or objects. The whole burnt offering having no other purpose in view but God himself alone, whom it is good to honor. The other two having ourselves in view, the preservation offering for the safe preserving and betterment of human affairs, and the sin offering for the healing of the trespasses which the soul has committed. So, whole burnt offering, preservation offering, sin offering. And the rituals for these sacrifices differ in the details of how the blood and the meat are handled. So we're going to focus on those differences. The general pattern is followed, but the details are in Numbers. Oh, I didn't include the blood application here. 5 is blood application. 6 is meat burning, and 7 is consuming the remainder. Okay. So Numbers 5 and 6, the application of blood to the altar and what's done with the meat. So first, the whole burnt offerings. In the whole burnt offering, the blood is splashed against the sides of the altar as the priest walks completely around it. The meat is prepared and then completely burned on the altar. Okay? All of it is burned there on the altar. Philo says this type of sacrifice honors God simply because he is God. It represents the dedication of one's whole life to God in purity. According to rabbinic tradition, this is also a way of making amends for sins of omission. Sins of omission, sins of commission. Sins of omission means the good things that you haven't done. Sins of commission are doing bad things. But sins of omission, the good things you haven't done, the whole burnt offering is an attempt to make amends for that. So what it represents is, okay, God, I know that I haven't done everything that I could have for you, but I'm committing myself to give you everything. And so you give everything to God. Okay, 2, the peace offering, or the preservation offering, as it says in the translation of Philo. In Hebrew, these are called peace offerings, using the word salam in Arabic. In Greek, they're called actually salvation offerings, soterion. But salvation here, salvation in English is a really loaded term. And what it really means in this Greek context is safety. So saving in terms of safety, or preservation. That's where the preservation offering comes from. This is a category that includes several subcategories, including thank offerings and vow offerings. These are all positive occasions for sacrifice. Sort of the theme of the preservation or peace offerings is let the good times roll. So, God has been good to you, and so you give thanks to him by offering this peace offering. And when you offer the peace offering to him, because God's been good to you, there's also an implicit connection that you want God to continue, you want things to continue to go well. And you want to continue in this positive relationship with God. The blood is treated in the same way as in the whole burnt offering. The priest takes the blood in a basin, walks around the altar of the whole burnt offering, and splashes the blood on each side, towards the base of each side. The difference here is in the handling of the meat. Whereas in the whole burnt offering, all of the meat is placed on the altar after it's been prepared. In this case, only one portion or one part of the meat is placed on the altar, which we could call the suet. It's a very technical term, suet. But suet refers to like solid fat that's in a certain place in the abdomen of animals like cows. And it's surrounding the liver and the kidneys. And it's this just like solid fat. And like if you wanted to be totally decadent and indulgent, that would be the thing you'd want to eat. Just like give me the fat. But in the law, people were not allowed to eat that. It was only for sacrifice to God. And so in the peace offering, that portion, that fat, that suet, is removed and it's burned on the altar as God's portion. And then there are other pieces which are designated to be given to the priests, the priest who offers the offering, who makes the offering. And then the remainder of it is returned to the worshiper to be eaten as a holy meal. And it's a holy meal because only people who are ritually clean, which is a term that means that they're able to participate in worship, only they can eat the meal. So it's an act of worship. Eating the meal is an act of worship. And what this represents is a dinner with God. God is the guest of honor, the priest is sort of second, and then the rest of the worshipers are eating together with God, sharing, feasting on the same animal. And it represents, in very dramatic terms, this fellowship and communion, which the people are rejoicing that it exists, that they have fellowship with God, and they want that fellowship to continue. So that's the significance of the peace offering. I'm going to just summarize a little bit. The sharing of the meat is not entirely clear if you read Leviticus, because it's really assumed. Most of the types of sacrifice in the ancient world were this kind of sacrifice, where part of the meat was given to the gods and the rest of it was eaten by the worshipers together. It was kind of a shared meal. However, there are hints of it. You have to look for it. So I gave you this reference, Leviticus chapter 17, 1 through 7, which I can't pass up. I'm going to read it. And the Lord said to Moses, "Say to Aaron and his sons, and to all the people of Israel, this is the thing which the Lord has commanded. If any man of the house of Israel kills an ox or a lamb or a goat in the camp, or kills it outside the camp, and does not bring it to the door of the tent of meeting to offer it as a gift to the Lord before the tabernacle of the Lord, blood guilt shall be imputed to that man. He has shed blood, and that man shall be cut off from among his people. This is to the end that the people of Israel may bring their sacrifices which they slay in the open field, that they may bring them to the Lord, to the priest at the door of the tent of meeting, and slay them as sacrifices of peace offerings to the Lord, and the priest shall sprinkle the blood on the altar of the Lord at the door of the tent of meeting, and burn the fat for a pleasing odor to the Lord. So they shall no more slay their sacrifices for satyrs, for false gods, after whom they play the harlot. This shall be a statute forever to them throughout their generations." To summarize, this is based on the common feature of ancient cultures. Almost all meat, perhaps all meat that was eaten, was produced by sacrifice in the ancient world. So eating meat and sacrifice were absolutely connected in people's minds. There was no such thing as secular butchering of animals. This is a problem that we see in the New Testament because Christians are afraid they can't eat meat that's being sold in the Gentile marketplaces because it is the product of sacrifice. And likewise, Jews couldn't eat meat offered in Gentile marketplaces because it was offered in sacrifice. So God commands that everything that is offered or that you eat has to be first offered as a peace offering. And has to go through this whole ritual so that it is incorporated into the worship of God. So that every meal becomes a meal with God, an act of worship. And also so that you don't have people who are continuing privately their pagan worship, because you can pretty well assume that if they're eating meat that hasn't been offered in the tabernacle, that's because that they have been offering pagan worship. So that's the significance here. Now, this is a rule during the time of wandering in the desert when all the people were together in one camp and the tabernacle was right there. I'm not going to read this next one, but in Deuteronomy chapter 12, verses 20 through 27, gives the tweak of that rule for when they enter the promised land. Because after they enter the promised land, they spread out throughout the land, and some of them live very far from the temple. And remember, there's only the temple for offering sacrifice. So do they all have to become vegetarians? You know, like when you want dinner, oh, run down to Jerusalem and kill us a sheep and bring it back. You can't do that. So God makes allowances and says that once you move into the land, if you are too far, so presumably everybody who lives close to the temple is still supposed to keep the old rule. But if you live too far, then you can kill an animal to eat without sacrifice, without the religious. So secular butchering comes into existence here. But it must not be offered as a sacrifice to false gods, of course. And you still need to offer, whenever you do want to offer specifically religious sacrifices, you still need to go to Jerusalem. But you don't have to become a vegetarian. Okay, sin offerings. Sin offerings are the final category. Sin offerings could be made only for unintentional sins or minor intentional sins after repentance and restitution. What that means is, for major sins, there was no sacrifice. There was only punishment in the old law. Okay? And we can talk about that and why that was. But sacrifices could only be offered for unintentional sins or for minor intentional sins. Sins of ignorance or sins that were involuntarily committed. The blood of the offering is handled in a different way from the other two categories of sacrifice. And then within sin sacrifices, it's offered it's used in different ways depending on who it's offered for. So if it's offered for either the high priest or the whole community of the people of Israel, then the blood is taken into the holy place, and the high priest stands before the veil that separates the most holy place from the holy place, and he sprinkles the blood 7 times towards the veil. Then he daubs it, meaning he smears just a little bit of it on the corners of the altar, which are called the horns of the altar. In the case of other sin offerings offered for just ordinary people, the blood is smeared on the horns of the altar that's outside. So the altar of the whole burnt offering is where it's smeared. Whereas maybe I didn't make it clear, the blood for the other cases was put on the altar of incense that is within the holy place. For the sin offerings for the high priest or the whole congregation, the portion, the suet, is offered to God on the altar. That's the minimum that has to be always offered to God from a sacrifice. And the rest of the animal is taken outside of the camp and burned in a clean place, so disposed of. So you don't burn it on the altar, you burn it outside the camp. For other people's sin offerings, the meat, the suet, again, is burned, and then the rest of the animal is given to the priest who offered it in behalf of the worshiper. And he eats it. And actually, he's required to eat it. There's a case where the priests failed to eat someone's sin offering, and Moses chastises them for it. So why is it significant that the priests eat that offering? It represents God's acceptance of their apology. So they've done wrong. They're committing to do right by offering this sacrifice. God shows that he accepts the sacrifice by eating it. And Philo of Alexandria is the one who tips us off for that. He says, the command that the sacrifice should serve as a feast for the priests is due to several reasons. First, to do honor to the givers of the sacrifice, for the dignity of the guests reflects glory on the entertainers, the hosts. Secondly, to secure them firmly in the belief that the graciousness of God extends to those who feel remorse for their sin. For he would never have called his servitors and ministers, the priests, to share the hospitality of such a table if full pardon had not been given. So for the priests to reject the meal was a sign that the sacrifice was rejected, and therefore the person wasn't forgiven. Conversely, when the priests eat the meal, it's a sign that God has accepted their forgiveness and fellowship has been restored. Now, but why this different form of offering the blood? Why is it smeared? There's no clear answer for that, but I think I have a relational explanation for that. And it has to do with the different context. So in this context, there's contrition and remorse and sadness for a sin that's been committed on the part of the worshiper. Think about the difference between approaching someone out of remorse and not approaching someone out of remorse and trying to develop a relationship with them. When you approach them in other circumstances, you're happy and you like, hey, how's it been? You give them a big hug. But when you're sad for your sins, there's some shame. Hopefully not overdoing it, but again, like some natural shame that comes in. You're just kind of like, hey, I'm sorry I screwed up, or, and there's also discretion in an ideal situation. There's discretion on the part of the person receiving the apology, that they listen quietly and attentively and don't make a big deal about it. My theory is that both of these features, the offering of the blood and the offering of the meat, are minimized both as a reflection of the offerer's shame and humility and as a reflection of God's not making a big deal about it. So think about the gesture. Just visualize in your mind the gesture for the other sacrifices where the priest takes big bowls of blood and it says literally toss. Like he tosses the blood and then tosses it on each side. It's like a big party. And then in both those cases, it's the meat is a big party too, right? Either in the whole burnt offering, you're throwing God a feast. It's a big dinner. It's a full table, all the meat. Or you're throwing a feast for God and yourself. So there's a big party that happens and you're included in the terms of the peace offering. But here, there's just a little bit offered to God, and we're not going to make a big deal about it. The blood is, just applied, just barely, just like touches the main points of the altar, the horns. The rest of it is discreetly poured out at the base of the altar. That's what it says. So after these either sprinkling and rubbing, or just the rubbing of the little bit of blood, the rest of the blood is poured out at the base of the altar, which is a holy place, but a big deal is not made about it. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, establishing the relationship, the covenant ratification sacrifice. We're getting near the end. So the Old Testament is the Old Covenant. A covenant is a formal, committed relationship in which both parties undertake certain responsibilities and obligations. So the Old Covenant is the relationship between God and Israel that was initiated by his promises to Abraham, but was formalized and inaugurated after the Exodus. And it was at that time on Mount Sinai that God gave Moses the laws of the covenant, and the people agreed to them, and then the covenant was ratified through a sacrifice. Exodus chapter 24, verses 3 through 8. And this is kind of a unique sacrifice, and I think it has importance for our understanding of Christ. So Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord and all the ordinances. This is after he came down from Sinai and he had the law that was given by God. And he tells the people, this is what God said. It's not just the 10 Commandments, it's a whole lot. And all the people answered with one voice. So they heard the law of God, and they answered with one voice and said, all the words which the Lord has spoken we will do. They committed themselves to it. And Moses wrote all the words of the Lord, and he rose early in the morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain and 12 pillars, according to the 12 tribes of Israel, so representing each of the tribes. And he sent young men of the people of Israel who offered burnt offerings and sacrificed peace offerings of oxen to the Lord. And Moses took half of the blood and put it in basins, and half of the blood he threw against the altar. Then he took the book of the covenant and he read it in the hearing of the people. So remember, the day before, he gives them a chance. He says, okay, just so you understand what you're getting yourselves into, this is the law of God. They said, we'll do it. And then the next day, he gives them another chance. He reads it all through again. And read it in the hearing of the people. And they said, all that the Lord has spoken we will do, and we will be obedient. And Moses took the blood and threw it upon the people and said, behold, the blood of the covenant, which the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words. So what's unique here is the throwing of the blood upon the people. We don't see that in other sacrifices. It's not seen in any other sacrifice. Blood is applied to people only in very specific cases. When the priests are ordained, a little bit of sacrificial blood is applied to their ears and their pinkies and their toes, and just like a little bit to consecrate them, to make them, give them access to the altar. And then when someone who has leprosy is reinitiated after they've been healed, reinitiated back to the worship of the altar, they're consecrated by having blood applied from the sacrifice to them. But people weren't sprinkled with blood, or definitely blood wasn't thrown. This is the same as with the basins against the altar. This is thrown on the people. I mean, they were drenched. So what is the significance of this unique ritual? Half of the blood was offered towards God, right? By being thrown towards the altar. And that's the same thing we see in the other sacrifices, right? Is the blood is offered towards God. What does it symbolize? It symbolizes the commitment to live in solidarity with God according to the right relationship, as we have been talking about. The other half of the God was offered toward the people, right? It's the same gesture, the same verb is used as how this blood was applied to the altar and towards the people. So it has the same meaning, it's just offered in different directions. So if the blood thrown towards the altar represents the people's commitment of faithful love towards God, then what does the blood thrown towards them represent? God's commitment to live in faithful love towards the people. And it happens in the context of a very clear reading out of the obligations of both parties. Both parties commit to it. The people by saying that we will obey God's law, and God, through his mediator Moses, by saying, "Behold, this is the blood of the covenant." And so this represents mutual commitments between God and the people. We can understand it also in terms of like blood brotherhood. You know, like when people want to become blood brothers, they make a little cut and they mix their blood together. Well, here we have symbolically, obviously this is animal blood, but symbolically it's offered as the blood, the people's blood. They offer their blood to God. And God offers his blood to the people, symbolically speaking. Now, after the covenant ratification ceremony, the regular sacrifices got rolling, and there were sacrifices that happened daily, weekly, monthly, annually, and on an ad hoc basis. Most of them were sacrifices that were on behalf of the whole people, offered at regular intervals. Daily, weekly, monthly, annually at certain feasts. Some of them were those ad hoc, voluntary offerings that were made just, for an individual's personal reasons. These sacrifices represented an ongoing renewal of the people's pledge to God, their commitment to offer him pure and perfect sacrifice. So in all those offerings, the people offer blood to God. But never again in those sacrifices in the Old Covenant did God offer blood to the people. Why not? Because he never broke his side of the agreement. They kept breaking it over and over again, and so they had to keep making up for it through their offerings of blood. So they have to keep repeating their commitment. God doesn't have to repeat his commitment because he is always faithful. So next week, we are going to talk about how Christ fulfills all of these sacrifices. And we're going to talk about a few specific sacrifices that we didn't get a chance to talk about today. The Passover sacrifice, the Day of Atonement, and maybe another one, I can't remember. All right, any questions? Sorry to keep you so long. I do try to keep it to an hour and a half, but there was a lot to talk about. All right, very good.